I'm Joshua Eisenman, co-host of today's discussion on China and the Global South. And we have reached the ultimate panel of the day, the one I've been looking forward to, the discussion of China's discourse power. And I have an all-star panel here. I'm going to introduce them quickly. To my left, I have Sarah Cook, Senior Advisor for China, Hong Kong, Taiwan at Freedom House. She's been the author of several reports about China's discourse power and media engagement. Next to her is Emeka Umejei, who is an author of at least one, if not two books on China's media engagement in Africa. A big fan of your work, Emeka. Welcome. And then to his left, we have Kenton Thibaut. Thibaut, okay, great. A senior resident fellow for China here at the Atlantic Council. And she serves as head of the China Research and principal investigator for projects examining China's role in global technology ecosystem. So welcome to you all. It's great to have you here to talk about China's discourse power. Well, you know that throughout the day, topics relevant to this panel have been discussed. And so in many ways, they've kind of done a great job to set the stage for us in our discussions here today. But before we go any further, I just want to start with a kind of preliminary question for you. And this is a question for all of you. I guess perhaps we'll begin with Sarah here. And just to explain, what are the elements of discourse power, and how does this differ from the media environment that we might be familiar here in Washington or in democratic or liberal democratic countries?
Well, that's a really good question. It's really just a pleasure to be here. I mean, I think it'll be interesting to see the different answers that we each have, because I think we've looked at this from different aspects. Look, within China, the discourse power of the Chinese Communist Party is that they basically control the information environment, and that's very different than what we're used to here. I think when we look at the transnational dimension in the Freedom House report and the work we've done in terms of looking at Beijing's global media influence, it's really a constellation of a lot of different aspects. So we've kind of included under that a number of different buckets in this toolbox. One is the propaganda dimension, which is often more overt, but not always. Another is the disinformation, which has been a growing space where the PRC and related actors have been operating. But then there's the censorship dimensions, the control over content infrastructure. So not talking about some of the surveillance elements, but just that companies based in China with close Chinese Communist Party ties control the information flow infrastructure in other countries. And then lastly, this element of trying to export China's model. So I think when we're talking about the different ways in which the Chinese Communist Party attempts to influence the media environment, and in many ways does in other countries, that's kind of how we look at it.
Excellent. Emeka, maybe you could hone it down into Africa and how you see this discourse power is happening on the African.
I think what I've seen over time is that the Chinese have tried to win over the African people through a blend of trying to excite the people locally. I'll give an example. There's what is called content sharing agreements, which is very, very which the Chinese people which they do a lot in African media. So you have, for instance, Xinhua news agency. You also have the local Chinese embassy in each of the African countries. They get into partnership with media organizations in Africa. So what happens is that they give them some form of advertising, revenue they get from the Chinese embassy. Then they share content with these people. So by sharing this content, the African media organizations, they get free, content from Xinhua, and as well also get, advertising revenue from the local Chinese embassy, which makes it very, very attractive, So, for instance, if you're coming from the West and you're saying, okay, but why are you doing this? They tell you, well, you can see we are gaining free content for this. We're also getting advertising revenue. What are you bringing to us? You say you want to bring investigative journalism. How much is it going to add to the bottom line? It's not going to add anything. So, I mean, this disadvantage the Chinese will bring, Then, in addition to this content sharing agreement, you have media exchanges. Yeah. So, they don't just give you media exchanges. They give media exchanges to media organizations where they have partnership with. So, for instance, if they have opportunities for, say in Ghana, for instance, they want to send like 10 journalists to China, they will give to media organizations they have media content sharing agreement with first, before they will now consider another media organization. So these are advantages that they play with, It makes it very, very attractive. So most times they are not struggling, It's not what they struggle for. I've done field work on media exchanges, and some of the journalists say, well, in order to gain opportunity, to gain advantage, we tend to write, propaganda over a period of time. So when you write this propaganda story, a very, very positive story about China, the embassy takes note of you and say, okay, oh, don't worry, we'll put you on the list, So it makes it easier. So it's not, they are not struggling any longer. Now the African journalists are struggling to get on, to be part of this bargain. So it makes it very easier for propagandas and, anything they want to do to move, Yeah. Recently we did a work that was funded by Freedom House, the Chinese digital satellite, in African villages. And we saw how the people were so excited about it. So it's very easy to, to now use that as a channel to send misinformation to the local people. No, but nobody knows that, because the problem we have here is that the government agencies in these countries, they are not up and doing. The media is not even aware of what is happening. Political actors, policymakers are not even in the space. So the Chinese could do whatever they want to do. So you see, it's a whole lot of packaging. So they sell this into the African media, and they're buying into it. So I don't know. Maybe we'll get to that stage where we say, what do we need to do? How do we countervail it? But for now, this is what it is. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Kenton. Do you want to add anything about this concept of discourse power?
Yeah, sure. So just kind of taking a step back from all of these, this kind of the great granular detail that we've gotten so far. The kind of idea behind discourse power is if you have the ability to set a narrative agenda, then that becomes fungible into a material power, right? And so the reason behind this, this isn't a new concept in China, but there's, the confluence of several different events have kind of made discourse power and the pursuit of discourse power be kind of higher on the agenda. So the idea behind it is that, for example, the discourse dominance of the United States, its ability to set agendas on the world stage, has led it to be able to structure the international system in such a way as it perpetuates U.S. values, and it results in institutional arrangements that are then designed to kind of perpetuate U.S. leadership, U.S. interests. And as an example, so values, the universal human rights, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of the press. These things are encoded, for example, into different governance standards that become the thing that you have to reach as a country if you want to get a loan from international institutions. So different values and the way that you kind of set the agenda is fungible into material power and influence, and that's the idea behind it. And China started to see, they're in a discourse deficit with respect to their status. And this especially in the context of, Xi rising to power, China's market power being able to kind of support this idea that they want more influence, but also in the context of this kind of China threat theory that they saw promulgating in largely Western contexts. This idea that the West has started to believe that, China's rise is a kind of existential threat. And that there's going to be no space for them to participate in the international system short of being able to shift the center of power in the international system away from the U.S. as much as possible to make room for their rise. So these are kind of the structural contexts that from which this kind of discourse power push and desire came about. And these kind of different factors came together really it can explain the urgency with which this is kind of being pursued, and then kind of the opportunity that China saw with its market power, its ability to kind of spread its message. So that's kind of the broader, I'd say, context for this.
Great. Well, let's build on that for a second. So the way you laid it out was actually quite similar to the way Nadège Roland talked about things earlier, in almost a zero-sum game here. That there's X amount of discourse power in the world. The U.S. has, X minus whatever, and that if China gains, it does so at the expense of the U.S. and vice versa. So I guess one question is that true? Is that the way that that you see it? And then the other is, where is this approach that you've all three defined the most effective in the global South? Where is it resonating, and where is it not resonating? Maybe we could, I don't know, we'll go the other way. So we'll start with Kenton first, sorry.
Yeah, so I'd say that despite China saying that it's not a zero-sum game, I think that their perception is that it is. And this is also related to China's national security concept, which basically puts the political security of the CCP kind of at the core, and all other kind of domains serve to flow into ensuring the political security of the
Holistic
CCP.
security, I think, is the term.
Right, like comprehensive, holistic, that kind of idea. And so part of that is that internal security and external security are mutually constitutive, right? If you don't have, first you need a secure internal environment, and you need to control your population ideologically. You need to have a strong economy. The military needs to be, meet certain standards, et cetera, but also the external environment needs to be secured in order for that internal environment to really stabilize as well. And so discourse power kind of functions in this external environment mode. You need to set the agenda, decenter U.S. power as much as possible so you can kind of create obstacles in the way of mobilization of Western powers that are aligned against your interests from the Chinese perspective. So discourse power kind of fits into that mode. And I think that China's operating as if it is zero-sum because they do see the structure of the international system as, not being amenable to currently accommodating it and where it believes its status is.
Oh. Emeka, would you like to build on that?
Well, I think for China, most times it is a zero-sum game because they want to be in the lead, they want to, and they see Africa as a space where they could, where they could take off. I've always seen from my research, I realized that for China, Africa is a learning curve. So it believes that if it makes mistakes in Africa, it will be able to correct itself in Africa. But if it does so in the global north, it won't be able to correct itself. It will lead to some form of mockery and sort of international disagrees. So what it does in Africa is to come to Africa, try out this model, then export it elsewhere. So in terms of effectiveness, the model that is at play as we speak now, it's a model that combines both Chinese media and local media in Africa. So you don't have, at the outset it used to be Chinese state media, expansion to Africa, but it's no longer what it is at this moment because now you have Chinese state media organizations in partnership with local media organizations in Africa. But the messaging is being done by local media organizations in Africa. So most likely, you're not going to see most of the messaging happening on CGTN, or you'll see it through the African media organizations. Because why? It is more effective if African people see it on African channels. It means that it has some credibility. But if it's coming from a Chinese platform, you could say, oh, these guys are propaganda. So so you have this kind of partnership model that's been tried in Africa, and it's become effective in Africa. Then it's been exported to Latin America as we speak. So you have the effectiveness of this Chinese model is in Africa. Africa is where it is most effective, then Latin America. For the global north country, they don't bother about us so much. If they get Africa, get Latin America, that's okay for them. They can start from there, then push into the rest part of the world. Asia is their base. Middle East is not something to bother about so much. They always get it because mostly dictatorship, so it makes it easier for them. So I think that as they perfect this model, and get it more engaged in Latin America, maybe someday we could see it in somewhere like maybe in Italy or Spain. Nobody knows, but anything can happen here. But even at that, we have some media organizations in Italy, in Spain, that are also part of the Belt and Road News Network.
Yeah.
So it's going to grow someday. Yeah.
So Sarah, let me hone on this question
Yeah.
a little bit. So it seems if Africa and Latin America, two of the places which had to deal with colonialism the longest and the most intensely, is that where China's discourse power is the most effective, as Emeka says, because there's this fertile ground of resentment that they're stoking? Is that how you see it, or are there other places, Italy, wherever that it's also effective?
Well, I would say, I mean, I think on this question of what's more effective, I would go with the tactics, and I think, agree with Emeka, but that it is really global. When the news consumers do not know that the information is coming from a Chinese state source, that's when it's most effective. And it's not limited just to Africa and Latin America, whether it's in terms of paid inserts or content agreements or paying commentators to write op-eds on the behalf of Huawei without saying they were paid by Huawei to do that. That came up in a good number of countries, or social media influencers who are very eloquent in local languages, but it's not clear necessarily that they're part of the China Radio International network. So I think just in general, whether it's the fake accounts and disinformation, the social media, the partnerships with local media outlets. Whenever you have a situation where news consumers don't actually know that this information is coming from Chinese state media, it just tends to be more convincing, just like what Emeka was saying. I think the other element in terms of the behind the scenes is the censorship side, because a lot of times you don't know what you don't know, right? And I think that's where you really see this activation of the broader elite co-optation and the economic ties. So for example, in the 30 countries that we examined, in about half of them you had a situation where a Chinese diplomat picked up the phone and tried to put pressure on a local journalist or an editor. And this was actually also, again, in the global north. It was in the UK as much as it was in places like Nigeria or Israel or places like that. It was in a variety of different countries. But it was actually in more countries, in 17 out of the 30, where it was a local media owner or a local government official that tried to suppress the coverage. And that's actually much more effective because in many countries, even though China is a global power and an authoritarian one, it's still a lot easier for a journalist to say to the Chinese embassy, what? No. And then to tweet about it and make a big uproar. Whereas when it's a local official or it's their boss or it's their editor who's changing the content of their article because the editor has been wined and dined by the Chinese embassy, and Emeka can give a lot of stories about that. But again, it's not only necessarily in Africa. Then that's much more effective. And I think in the Latin America context, you do see this increasing, how would you say? Not currying favors, but I would say trying to bring in the media owners of major media conglomerates, especially because there's a high level of concentration of ownership in countries like Brazil or in Argentina, and just increasing ties, and that funnels down. So now in Brazil, you do have a daily night show that's a partnership between CGTN and one of the major media outlets in Brazil in Portuguese. And sometimes it's Portuguese journalists who are being the anchors, and sometimes it's ethnic Chinese who are speaking Portuguese. So I think that element of how the other forms are elite co-optation and other forms of economic incentives that can be provided. So for example, if you're a media outlet that's trying to get dramas into China, that can then be used to be able to create some kind of other partnership that generates the content to really the Main Street audiences. And that's what we found, just country after country. In just 30 countries, we counted 130 outlets that had these kinds of partnerships that were funneling basically some kind of Chinese state-produced or co-produced content to local audiences via the mainstream media. So that's very effective.
So 130 countries around the world.
130 outlets in just 30 countries.
In just 30 countries. Wow.
And it was across the political spectrum. I think this is again where they've really expanded, where they tried it out in a few places, and then they started, and in one country you get one media outlet, well now you're going to go to the competitor. And you're going to be like, well they're doing it, well why don't you do it too? And so but then in terms of, again, especially places where politics are somewhat polarized, they really do reach across the political spectrum, and then you start to get these more specialized publications that are for more niche audiences. So in 16 countries, just from 2019 to 2021, you had some kind of new partnership agreement. So that's really just an area of expansion that to their credit, it's very effective.
One thing I'll just say, broadly speaking, is that this is something we've seen the Communist Party do since it was created, which is experiment with things. If it works, expand it. If it doesn't, dial it back, and then find other ways. And so they've been very effective, even in terms of agricultural reform. Similar.
The little pilot projects at the local level, and then
and then these different model, special economic zones, et cetera. So, what you guys have said is really fascinating, because on one level you're saying China is not credible because when the voice comes from China, local people don't buy it. So at one, it's kind of belies the fact that nobody wants to accept what they say, but at the same time, you're also saying, all three of you, if I'm understanding, that China's gotten really good at what we call astroturfing, right? Taking a message, making it seem like it's from a grassroots organization, and then pushing it out there into the audience. And we've talked quite a bit in this day about training. And so media training becomes an important venue. Emeka, your work goes into this quite a bit. So I wonder, maybe we can start this question with you, and then if either of you want to weigh in and say, how effective do you think China's training of African media is? And of course, feel free to enter the entire global South. And why is it effective? If it is effective, why is it effective, and how is it effective? And is there anything that we here in the United States or other Western countries should do to compete with it, or is it a kind of Chinese specialized thing that we shouldn't compete with? How do you see this?
Okay, I mean, a bit of historical background.
Yeah.
Media exchanges was started by the Russians in the 1960s. I think it was at the University of Nairobi. So it was that was first by the Russian people. Then before the West took it over, then bettered it over time. Then the PRC just came into this thing not quite, more than maybe 10, 15 years ago. But what has happened is that because over time there's been no media training for African journalists. I was a journalist for more than 1 decade, and there was no. I didn't go for any training. So usually a media organization is supposed to send the journalists. So go on. But for over 1 decade that I was a journalist, nobody sent me on any training. So if I had the opportunity for the Chinese embassy to say, okay, come, there's an opportunity for you to go to China, I would have had it, I'm just trying to be sincere to you. So the first problem is that lack of training opportunity for African journalists. So, and then the PR sort of fills that gap, and says, okay, we have training opportunity for you. Now, the training opportunity is not very much, it's well paid. The remuneration is very, very attractive. So, I give you an example. As a journalist in Nigeria, maybe you are paid, your salary for 1 month is about maybe $100,
Wow.
Yeah, even if it's up to that, Now you have an opportunity to go to China, you are being paid $1,000 per month, flight, So you come back, when you come back, maybe in 4 months, if you go for 4 months training, you come back with about $2,000 to $3,000. That's a whole lot of money. You can build a house in Nigeria. So it's very, very attractive. Number one, even if you don't think the money is much, so it's attractive too. So people want to go. And people are struggling to go. It's not the Chinese people. People want to go. Because I interviewed journalists who had gone from around Africa, and they tell me, well, when I came back, I was able to build a house. Yeah, I came back, I was able to buy a land. I came back, I was able to buy a new car. So anytime I look at that car, I remember, this was what I got from China. So that keeps on reminding them, oh, this is what China did for me when I went for this training. So that's something they keep on they look up to. So I think the only way, one of the ways that, the West and other people could get into this thing is organized training for African journalists. Then there's also the problem of, visas. When African journalists get these opportunities to go to China, they are given visa, they don't get denied visa. Yeah. So the next problem is visas, African journalists sometimes get fellowship to go to, especially EU. They are denied visa. I remember recently was at the GIGC workshop in Sweden. Most of journalists were denied, most of them from Nigeria. I remember an editor was telling me, because I had to interview them, was telling me that, well, that if he gets an opportunity to go to China, he would dive at it, he would jump at it, So, so these are some of the things we're talking about. So the only way, one of the ways that the West could get into is to also organize trainings for people. Yeah. Then, try to make this training, let it not be in Africa. Sometimes take these people out, because they also gain social capital, by saying, okay, we went to China. So because what I saw from it, when they return back, they become this kind of official propaganda exponent for China. So for the peers, oh no. So when their colleagues say no, this is, they said, no, you don't know, you have not been there, you don't know China. We have been to China. You know, I went there, I saw myself. Don't worry about what these people are telling you. You know, so they become, you know, unofficial spokesperson for the PRC in the newsrooms.
Yeah.
So you see, so the only way you could also counter this thing is to also take some of the journalists from Africa, take them to the West. So they undergo a few training, they come back, they say, no, we've also gone here. This is better than what you have gone to. I think that's what I think myself, yeah.
Well, I'm happy to hear you say that because that was one of the recommendations in my USIP report.
Okay.
So hopefully the USG was going to pick that one up, right? Expand the Monroe program, begin to actually, and obviously if the State Department and others are engaged, well, who controls the visas, right? So you would hope that there would be.
You would hope.
You would hope.
But-
You would hope. One would hope. Kenton, do you have any thoughts about training, whether it be in Africa or other places in the Global South?
Sure. We did a study on media training in Pacific Island countries and comparing, you know, coverage of China before and after, and noticed that for about 6 of the newspapers we did several case studies of journalists who went and we tracked kind of like what they were writing. That not only was it, you know, exclusively positive about China post-trip, but also news that was like local news content that journalists would cover previously had been supplanted with news about China, right? So you're not only getting more positive news coverage of China, for example, or a skewed vision of you know, China in general, but also a crowding out of a space for resources for journalists to cover issues that are of interest to their own local populations. So that was something that we noticed in the picks. I also want to bring up we partner with this amazing firm called 26 Technologies on some of our data scraping, and they did a study where we gathered about 400,000 articles from traditional news media websites from about 2023, 40% of which were in English, from dozens of countries. And found that China tended to be much more effective when covering China priority events in English versus when it's competing with other, you know, outlets like BBC, et cetera, like for coverage of any other international event. For example, in the 2023 Asian Games in Hangzhou, 3/4 of the English language news articles published, and this includes Global South countries, Global North, like all across the world, 3/4 of the English language news articles published outside of China came from PRC state media. Another example was the Third Belt and Road Forum. 16 of the 20 top countries with the highest percent of PRC state-authored English language content published about the Belt and Road Forum were in the Global South. The highest was Namibia, with about 90% of articles about the Belt and Road Forum being state content, and 3.3% of all English language news in Namibia, for example, was from PRC state-authored content. And again, as Sarah was saying, it's not just the Global South, but in the U.S. as well, 33% of all English language news about the Belt and Road Forum, the Third Belt and Road Forum, was from PRC state-authored content. At the same time, you know, in the sample survey, just 0.13% of English language news published in countries besides China was PRC state sourced. So they are competing with, you know, the media environment they're competing with is really strong, and they don't do super well with like, you know, traditional, more established and open news organizations for more open societies. But when it's that specific thing related to PRC interests, there is an overwhelming you know, amount of coverage that comes from state sources.
Can I say something on
Of
that?
course,
training?
yeah, no.
I think one thing that the Chinese government is very adept at is the content of the trainings. Well, first of all, there's a lot of different kinds. There's like just the junket to go for a couple of weeks. And then there's these longer term ones, and I think that especially that investment in the longer term periods is what can really provide the professional development advantages to African or other journalists, but also can really change people's minds. I think, and some of the people that our Ghana analysts spoke to who had gone on, I think it was maybe some of the shorter ones, you know, they came back and they were like, honestly, their views of China were kind of, you know, more negative. They're like, oh, we hear about China being oppressive, and now we saw how oppressive China is, right? So I think it varies. But the other element is that there are often very real skill set dimensions to the training. So it's not all just propaganda. So there's elements related to how to use digital technology. Like, they're actually real skills that journalists need in addition to the language elements and all of that. So they're all real benefits. And so, of course, that gets very complicated because you end up with both benefits and risks and things like that. So I think that's also one thing to keep in mind in terms of, training opportunities to make sure that they have actual real skills for journalists to acquire and to bring back. As well as part of the programming, maybe if you're, to allow people, say, to meet with refugees or torture survivors from China or dissidents from Russia or some of these other governments that are engaged in these countries, and, trying to give them an opportunity to meet with other voices from those countries. So it's not me as a Freedom House person, researcher, saying, oh, you should, this or that, but somebody who's actually, lived through the darker side maybe of the CCP's rule and can speak directly to that to round out the, the narrative, to at least balance it out, because those are voices that otherwise they wouldn't hear, and they're certainly not hearing when they're going to China.
Yeah, one thing that we've been talking about, and I want to say, is that this engagement with people, building relationships with people, is so important. It's it goes back to Confucius, right? So this idea that it's an essential part of foreign relations to build relations, right? It sounds almost axiomatic, but for China, it's really a priority. Now, I want to drill down on some of the, Kenton had mentioned some topics, and I want to ask you guys about China's discourse, power, approach to certain topics. I've noticed, for instance, that when it comes to the way that China's discourse vis-a-vis Europe tends to be something like, Europe is good, America's bad, don't work with America, strategic autonomy. Now, of course, as we know, the effort, or the Russian invasion of Ukraine and China's support for Ukraine has kind of put the European-China relationship in a difficult place. But if you look at this compared to the discourse in Africa or Latin America, where it's the West is bad, right? So it seems that you've got a kind of double narrative going on here, both in English, but targeted at different places. So how does this work? I mean, and how effective is it to have this kind of double narrative, one where you're like basically linking the U.S. to Europe because Europe's the bad guy, and in the other, you're trying to say that America's the bad guy. How does this particular narrative play?
Well, first of all, you're looking for consistencies within CCP propaganda, and that's just not going to happen.
Well, I'm highlighting inconsistencies.
Because, well, look, first they said that, that COVID was from Fort Detrick, and then they say it's this fake Swiss, scientist, and then there's this like Italian thing. So sometimes they're like just going to come up with a bunch of different things to see kind of what sticks. So I don't know that there's necessarily there's a lot of thought. First of all, even though it's a massive propaganda apparatus, it is very decentralized in many ways, and so. There's sometimes coordination, like on something like the Belt and Road or the 100th anniversary of the CCP. Like, that's very clear that there's coordination. But on other things, there may not be. And so you might have one part saying one thing that contradicts the other. I would still say that I feel like the U.S. is the big boogeyman, even though they're like, they're anti-West and building on kind of the colonial history and things like that. I still think when you look at the propaganda, the narratives, especially again during this period that we were particularly looking at, where you had the crisis in Xinjiang really coming to the fore, the protests in Hong Kong, and COVID-19, a real effort to just blame the U.S. And this was across both the Trump and the Biden administration, and so I think like it was just really very focused on the U.S. more so than necessarily. Europe, at least in the.
Let me build on that and ask Emeka a question based on this. So, Joseph Asunka's organization, Afrobarometer, puts together some great work. And one chart that I saw, it really made me scratch my head because it seems to contradict this idea of this kind of zero-sum game. And what it was it suggested that there is a correlation between negative views of China and negative views of the U.S. In countries where there are negative views of China that are high, these countries are more likely to have negative views of the U.S. In countries where they are low, the same. So this is interesting. China is looking at a zero-sum game, but at least in the African countries, according to the Afrobarometer, it seems that people might say, look at this negative and say, you know what, a pox on both your houses. Or, and I wonder, I think of in the United States, we have people who are more globalist and people who are more kind of nativist. And is that what's going on here, that China and the US are misunderstanding that it's not really a zero-sum game, that when they say negative things, that's just leads people to think negatively about both of them? Or how should we understand this correlation?
Well, I think in Africa, I think from my own experience, I think it's very, very complicating. It's complex. But what remains is that in some parts of Africa, the U.S. has certain advantages because one, the English language, the long history, So there's this problem of trust, Mm-hmm. Even though people love the Chinese, the Chinese have built roads and built, but the trust is also not there. Mm-hmm. So they are more likely to trust the West. I mean, I'll give you an example. I remember when I was conducting my fieldwork in Kenya so many years ago, one of the journalists was telling me that they went to China. They went with some Kenyan politicians. So when they got to China, the Kenyan politicians were telling him that, please, we don't even know what we are here to do. We don't even we don't even know what is happening here, but we just say we should come and see what is happening, So there's this problem of trust actually with the PRC. Even though African political actors believe that they will have access to, financial resources to fund infrastructure projects in Africa from the PRC, but trust is not there. Trust is a big factor. They are more likely to trust the West because they believe, okay, we know this is what it is. If it says like this, what it's going to be. So I think those are factors we should consider when we look at this whole issue of, how they consider both the U.S. and Africa. It's a complex actually. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's not a very straight thing, but trust is a very, very critical issue. I mean, I remember in the fieldwork I did recently. I mean, people were saying, well, people here, our people have made money from the U.S. Our uncles, they went to the U.S. and they made money, they prospered in the U.S. So, I mean, we prefer the U.S. So those issues come up too. People tend to prefer the U.S. because of, long-standing history of people who have known over time, people you could also trust. Mm-hmm. But average Nigerian, the problem of trust with the PRC is always there. Mm-hmm. We don't trust them. Mm-hmm. Even though they fund the projects, we know, but in terms of trust, we don't trust them. And so that's a factor we have to consider.
Interesting. So, Kenton, I want to turn to you, and you could feel free to touch on any of these comments, but I want to ask you, recently, I happened to be in China at on October 7th. And so we kind of watched in real time the evolution of China's policy. The Notre Dame, along with Dave, we were in Israel a couple of years before, and we had a meeting in Israel, and the Israelis seemed very positive about the China relationship. But it seemed that after this, we've seen that China has essentially taken a hard position against Israel and has kind of leveraged sentiment in the global south to its advantage, basically suggesting that the U.S. is the supporter of Israel and Israel's apartheid state, yada, 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 and we're on the side of the oppressed nations and the victims, et cetera, the Marxist narrative that we're all familiar. So let me ask you this. How effective is that, do you think, in the global south? Is it resonating as they would want it to? And are there any consequences for this kind of approach?
Yeah, I think first to kind of get to that, we have to kind of think about what's the ultimate goal in all of this, with China's discourse power strategy. And at the very, very core, it's about decentering U.S. leadership, primarily focused on U.S. leadership in the global stage so that China feels like it has the space it needs to, accomplish, to secure its interests, to rise like it believes it should. This is an existential thing. Like, this is that kind of at the core of what discourse power is about. And so from that, there are some general goals that they do have broadly that you can divide kind of by region. So, for example, if you think that you need to decenter U.S. power in the international system, you're going to want to drive a wedge in the alliance system. That is probably the main goal of China's tactics that are focused on EU, Australia, UK, U.S., Canada. Let's think of ways to drive wedges in the alliance system. In the Global South, for example, it's going to be disparaging U.S. leadership while coalition building with the intention of mobilizing the support that they get from elites in different international fora, for example, like the UN, that can convert into votes for China-sponsored proposals, because then again, going back to agenda setting, if China's proposal is adopted in international fora, that then, in their minds, starts to structure, how states are able to engage in different activities, from economic to security, et cetera, that pays dividends that way. And then lastly, another goal is always to defend China's core interests, and that's kind of global. And then the tactics are kind of derived from the goals, and the tactics are much more kind of tailored to specific environments. So for example, if you want to drive a wedge in the alliance system, you're going to message a lot to France about how the UK and the US and Australia stabbed it in the back when AUKUS was signed, for example. You're going to kind of approach different countries in Europe to try and divide and conquer, to kind of promote that strategic autonomy narrative that will, in their minds, weaken the alliance system by having Europe divided on how close to be with the US, for example. And then to this question of kind of public opinion, that is not necessarily the goal of discourse power, right? Talking about all of this, it's about coalition building that then can be converted into mobilization in pursuit of China's interests at a multilateral level. You don't really need public opinion in some places to be on your side to be able to convert, elite support for votes in the UN, for example. The last thing, so for example, the different events, China's gleeful critique of the U.S. And Israel in the gleeful critique of how the U.S. And Israel are kind of isolated in the UN, for example. This goes back to kind of this overarching aim, and it is, I think, primarily targeted at the U.S. U.S.'s leadership is declining. The U.S. does not represent the interests of all countries. It's on the wrong side of history. Look, it's completely isolated. Other countries are not on the side of the U.S. and Israel. China's a friend to all, and this kind of goes back into those core messages that we've really been seeing them kind of push forward. And just one last note that over the past year, there's really three main propaganda messages that they've been really pushing on the global level. China's a friend to all. China's a leader on the global stage. You can trust in China's leadership. U.S. leadership can't be trusted. So this kind of all fits in with that.
I mean, I would say I think part of it is that if you look at the political landscape and media landscape in the Middle East, it's all very much not often driven by public opinion, right? So if you're trying to get votes, or looking at various advantages and elite, then siding with one side of this conflict becomes. But then again, this isn't an area of Chinese foreign policy I necessarily study, but that can make more sense. I mean, I think you see on the Israeli side a tremendous amount, including people in Israel who worked with us we had Israel as one of the case studies, a tremendous amount of shock and disappointment. And not only the statements from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, but the level of anti-Semitism on the Chinese internet. And of course, then you get the manipulation on the Chinese internet, what's allowed, what's not, what nationalist voices are allowed to speak, what human rights groups and voices are not allowed to speak. So I think I think in terms of Israel's perspective on China, including the people in Israel who have spent a lot of time working on China, I think it's been a real shift.
So let me ask a question, all three of you, and we'll let you decide who wants to answer it first, right? So one of the meta-narratives is certainly this idea China is a global South country. China has lessons that countries in the global South can learn from, and specifically a lesson on development, right? That China pulled itself up from its bootstraps and developed, and you too can do so if you follow us. And then and this is juxtaposed, well, not juxtaposed, but it's linked with a political argument that says Western liberal democracy is just one kind of democracy. We've got a better form of democracy, right? So we can develop better, and we have a better political system, so follow us. And we understand the global South because we are one of you. So the question I have for you is, we are now living in a world where the Chinese economic model is faltering. No one knows the future, but at this point, systemically, it looks pretty bad going forward. we're looking at a time when Xi Jinping has maxed authoritarianism, and we talked about the cameras. Victoria Hui has talked about the cameras, and we saw the treatment of Africans in China during COVID, right? The authoritarian state reaching down, literally picking people out of their homes, and this spreading virally on the media, even that the Nigerian minister spoke directly to his Chinese counterpart. So the meta-narrative China puts out there seems to be in stark contrast with a lot of the headwinds it's facing now. So if you're sitting in the propaganda bureau in Beijing, do you think you've got to change your narrative? Is your narrative in jeopardy? Because when you bring your African delegations, they're going to see unfinished projects. They're going to see that China is not what it's saying it is in its propaganda. And so is China facing a messaging problem, a discourse power problem on the horizon because its narrative is going to be disjointed from the reality?
No, can I just chip in a bit?
Yeah, of course you can.
I don't think so exactly. You know why? Because even if Chinese economy is going down, even at a greater speed than it is now, the Chinese will do everything humanly possible to continue to fund African countries. So it will never compromise that massive funding for African countries. Because if it does that, that means it is gone already. Because most of its power comes from its engagement in Africa. So it will continue to sustain the engagement in Africa, funding infrastructure development, just name it. Because as far as China is concerned, Africa is like, how would I put it? Africa is like, that's where the glory comes from. If it's doing well in Africa, it gets the whole attention. Everybody's, oh, that's what China is doing in Africa. And then it goes elsewhere. So it will never make the mistake of just leaving Africa to flounder. No, it will not do that. So it will continue to fund projects in Africa, despite the challenges it's having in its economy in China. So what will happen is that most African political actors will not see what you are seeing because you are based in the US, right? So you see it from this lens. But because they're in Africa and they're still getting the same funding they're getting from China, they will never feel that, they will never see that.
So in the global south, do they understand that the Chinese economy is facing headwinds? Do they understand that Xi Jinping is a new type of leader? Has this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, a lot of the China coverage, except for things like Belt and Road, there's still, I mean, you talk to editors and look at some of the content, a lot of it is still from like international news wires. Like they'll use Xinhua for sports and culture and things like that, or for Pan-Africa stories, which Xinhua and the state media cover very well. But for some of this hard news, financial stuff, like people know where you're going to get accurate information. I mean, I think the question of the CCP's actions undermining its narratives, that's not really anything new. That's what they're constantly fighting against. So, but I think that's why they're turning more and more to the other tactics, to the covert tactics, to the disinformation, to the using the economic power to create the incentives for locals either to magnify their own messaging or to censor and suppress other voices. And I think from that perspective, I mean, Kenton was talking a little bit about what is the party's goal. First of all, yes, it's to make the world safe for the CCP. That's like the #1 goal. But I think it goes more than beyond being pro-China or anti-US. First of all, it's anti-criticism or anti-alternative Chinese or diaspora voices that might represent a view or a voice of Chinese people that is different from what the CCP presents. And we haven't talked much about the Chinese diaspora, but that's really where, on the one hand, very effective in controlling media, but very brutal and ruthless in terms of investing resources to crush or to counter even artistic initiatives. So you had an Australian a Chinese-Australian artist who's trying to do a gallery who's very irreverent in his artwork towards Xi Jinping in Poland, and the embassy went and tried to stop it. You saw there's a new Tiananmen, I think, play in Texas, I think, and some of their actors and cast and crew were from China were targeted. There was one report about the Shenyun Performing Arts Company. Something like 81 incidents of Chinese diplomats trying to stop the shows and that was in different countries around the world. I think what's interesting is the flip side, which is the pushback and the resilience. And so like in that Shenyun example, there was something like 40 cases of pushback, including in places like Mexico, Peru, the Dominican Republic. They don't perform in Africa, but I think you see like and in Poland, that case, the embassy, they pushed back, right? So I think you also see the situation where some of those diplomatic engagements and activities, when you have certain level of either it's norms or democratic institutions, again, face pushback. So then what do you start to see? You start to see more of these covert, the disinformation. And so I think that's what we're seeing now too, increasingly. So far it's been more targeting places like, well, Taiwan obviously, but the US, Canada, Australia, of disinformation networks with fake accounts that are meddling in domestic politics. And it's not necessarily partisan. It's more about undermining the trust. It's about amplifying partisan divisions and undermining trust in the local government. And so I think that's where you're, again, maybe their actions undermine their narratives, but the propaganda apparatus or well, it's all kinds of different parts of the party. There's like the PLA getting involved in these things too, right? But like that's why it's so important to look at the broader set of tactics and how they actually exert the discourse power, because actually it is very sharp or even hard sometimes in the sense of mobilizing the economic incentives and sometimes even physical threats. And we're talking about say Chinese diaspora and transnational repression.
Yeah. Kenton, did you want to add anything to this discussion?
Oh yeah, just to Sarah's point of this is kind of, you kind of have to look a little bit bigger picture than maybe just like one-off events, and to kind of keep in mind that the aim is really to change ecosystems for the long term, to change I study internet governance more and more, like how China builds coalitions around, in G77 countries that are then deployed in different forums that deal with internet governance. And the goal there is really to kind of, pull all of these different levers, mobilize the, groups that they've been cultivating in different countries to really like push forward proposals and get support for things that will actually kind of restructure how the internet is governed, for example, trying to sideline civil society organizations that have long been, determining, governance and technical protocols of the internet to more multilateral fora, which we think of as like kind of the UN and UN processes. And the reason for that is, one country, one vote. China can kind of divide and conquer. It kind of prefers to engage state to state level. It does not like civil society involvement in these things. And this is really kind of the bigger picture. Discourse power is about restructuring global ecosystems. And that's the kind of the thing I think to
And these
keep
key
in mind.
nodes in the information flow.
Yeah.
I think that's where you get to this question of some of the content infrastructure, the digital television. It's, and social media platforms like a WeChat, that it's not necessarily then that Chinese state media are one voice. It's that you have actors that have very close ties to the party or their own, potential threats they or their family could face, who are now the gatekeepers, right? And so then they can actually decide who can actually channel information to local audiences. And that's, I think that's where, in terms of response and safeguarding and trying to ensure diversity and best practices and supervision over, becomes very important before that gets activated in a way that at that point it's maybe too late.
This is great. Now, I've got two questions. I'm going to put them both on the table, and you guys can scrum me.
Okay, we got 3 minutes.
Okay, we have three and a half. So, okay. So the first is whether you look at Pew or you look at Afrobarometer or you look at other surveys in Africa, in Europe, views of China are falling around the world. So the first question is, does this suggest that yes, they're trying to change the ecosystem, but they're not succeeding, that they're continuously, the social media and the cell phones and the traditional stuff, but ultimately, is the wind blowing too hard? That they're kind of blowing against the wind, and the wind is just, such that even their best efforts are not enough to overcome the fact that there is this negative sentiment out there, perhaps born of the political and economics or other issues. So that's the first question, right? Is why, in amidst all of this effort, they're still facing negative perspectives. And the other, and maybe this one is more for Emeka, but others can jump in, is we've just seen the creation of the Tanzania Julius Nyerere School. Okay, China has now created a school in Africa to train Africans. It's never done this in any other place of the global south, and I've never heard of any other country doing it anywhere. So we haven't mentioned this school, so I wonder if we can touch on these two questions, these negative trends, and then, the Nyerere School and what we think that's going to turn into. Feel free to
Well, Well,
You want to go? You
I
go
will
first.
start with the school. Is that fine?
And we only have
Yeah,
2.5
I will start with
minutes.
the school. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, the essence of the school is to create, political leaders that will, help implement the PRC's leadership model or government model in Africa.
Yeah.
And so when political actors from that South African countries go to that school, they come up with that idea. They have these communist ideas of what government should look like. It should look like, So that helps the PRC to, sort of enhance the kind of legitimacy for their own model in Africa, in those countries over there. So I think it's just I think they're aiming for the future of trying to influence the political leadership in Africa. And that's what it is, yeah.
It's pretty amazing to take the host diplomacy and bring it to the continent.
Yeah, so.
Right?
Well, but that's the element of the local agency because they're doing it in partnership with 6 local
Yeah,
countries
6
and
countries,
dominant political parties. And when I was looking at them, I was like, all right, so where do they rate on Freedom House's freedom in the world? But it's actually because 2 are free, 2 are partly free, and 2 are not free. So it's something that's cutting across different aspects of democratic development. And you see these dominant political parties that are interested in this kind of party-to-party training.
Yeah.
So I think that's, that's actually a really important dimension of it. I mean, I think to your question about their actions are constantly undermining their narratives, and then global media cover it. But again, I think just to go back to the question of then using other tactics that end up influencing people's opinion when they don't know that their opinion is being influenced, become a greater investment. The other thing is that, especially Afrobarometer and others, you have more nuanced questions. So you have a lot of people in these countries who will recognize that the political system in China, they don't like it, the human rights problems, but they still want economic engagement. So you have local audiences with sometimes nuanced and sophisticated perspectives about, the bilateral relationship.
Kenton, why these negative trends if they're investing so much?
I guess I kind of always go back to, is public opinion really like the thing that they really care about in a lot of places? And I'd say for a lot of this stuff that maybe not. But I think that public opinion always kind of goes up and down with China and the US as well. So I don't know, I think that maybe the goal is, yes, to an extent, positive views of China, but also drowning out other voices. There are negative goals like making you too afraid to kind of report on anything else, making you too afraid to report on negative stories about China. So the public opinion numbers to me don't translate directly in a one-to-one to the impact China's having. So I would think that maybe we should kind of look a little bit more at how is China penetrating an ecosystem from like what levels and to what extent to better understand the impact maybe that they're having in a particular information
And
environment.
just to add to that very briefly, so in 16 out of the 30 countries, we found journalists or commentators reporting about self-censoring related to China. And that's not only events inside China, but also Chinese investment or engagement locally, which arguably would be of more interest to local audiences. So I think that's exactly what Kenton's talking about, where there's this element of creating incentives that disincentivize against certain types of reporting that they don't want to see.
It's fascinating because in spite of all this, the numbers are still falling. You would think that there would be, but one could always argue we don't know what we don't know, and there may well have fallen harder and faster had there not been these efforts, right? So it's a kind of known unknown, as
That's a
one
good
man
counter.
once said. Well, this has been a fascinating discussion, and I love the work you guys are doing, and I can't wait to read more of it. So thank you all for staying from the beginning to the end. This was a fantastic panel, and before we applaud our panelists, I just want to say, tomorrow, 8:45 a.m., we're going to start again, and we're going to continue our discussions on China and the Global South. So please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.
Wow.